And there are a number of examples. These are just a few, and a few that relate particularly to Africa that I've been involved with. Feed the Future, Power Africa, Trade Africa. Again, that's just a very, very short list. And we talked already about trade capacity building linked to trade agreements like CAFTA-DR and TPP. So this is what I wanted to spend, if I have a few more minutes. Good, okay. This is what I wanted to talk about. Where do we go from here? How do you implement all this? How do you take all of these rules and these structures and think about a way forward on trade development? So I'm going to just put out a few ideas that I've been working on and would love to hear your thoughts and your questions when we have time for discussion. So again, I think we've got a really good structure that we probably could enhance. And I know many of you work on these programs day to day. So, you know, as you think about how to make preferences work, think about some of the things that we talked about, and FTAs likewise, and the WTO, which is an ever-evolving system. But are there other models that we could be thinking about? Have we really covered everything on development that we could? I would say, of course not. We probably will always be evolving these systems. So what might those models look like? And I think that Africa is a great place to have that conversation because, again, I think the trade relationship with Africa is at a bit of a turning point. Africa has deepened its trade ties with Europe and gone now out of preferences into more reciprocal trade agreements. They've been very controversial for a lot of reasons. They have some aspects that I think are probably not as development focused as they could be, but other ways, like I talked about, in which they're very innovative. And so could we learn from that? Could we think about that? Is there a way that even through something like TTIP that maybe countries could come together and think about strategies and development approaches? Because there is a challenge sometimes, I think, when there are a lot of different models and a lot of different mechanisms, and countries will sometimes wonder which path to follow and how do they determine themselves what their systems should look like, which every country has to do on its own. So this value chain approach that I said was embedded in TPP, I'll show you a slide in a minute of how that approach might break down for agriculture, for example, which is still a huge topic of conversation and one that isn't sometimes covered as much as it could be through trade disciplines, but definitely where development really hits in a lot of places. And something that I call development corridors. It's that notion that I mentioned before of how do you link the hard infrastructure to a system that goes around it that not only helps to inform where that infrastructure needs to go, and it probably comes as no surprise that sometimes when the infrastructure projects are being designed, that the needs of the smaller companies, or maybe the agricultural sector, or maybe women traders, are not always being brought to the table because those groups are probably not always part of the negotiations on infrastructure development. But I think that if we really want to make trade work for development, we need to think about how those systems can reach as many people as possible. And how do you build a regulatory system around an infrastructure network? And then what are some different models for how to implement law and regulation? So I'll say just a word about that, and then I'll show you two more slides, and then I'll stop. But one of the things that we've been doing through my organization, and again, I started this organization, so I've been working in this field for 20 years. I started out as a trade lawyer. I worked at USTR as a trade negotiator for 6 years. I then went into development. After that, I went to a nonprofit after I left USTR, which was not the most common career path out of USTR 10 years ago, and worked on trade development, first focused on women in the global economy, which was something I was very passionate about, and then more broadly, trade and development, focused in sub-Saharan Africa, but I've also done work in other regions as well. Not as much in Latin America as Caleb has, which is great, because he'll talk more about Latin America, but really quite broadly. And one of the things that I saw was that when we talk about, I said this before, when we talk about trade and development, we tend to talk about it, at least in most of the circles I run in, from a very top-down perspective, instead of really thinking about what does it look like in reality, and how do you take that and help to inform what happens at these very high levels and the policy levels. So we started developing different models for doing that. And I went back to my legal roots and thought, well, one of the challenges is that many people don't know what the rules really are. So maybe if we can design some tools to help break those down in a simple way, but also every country that we worked in, I just yesterday completed a regulatory assessment for the agricultural sector in India, looking at one state, but also looking at some of the national level policies. We probably looked at about 200 different laws and measures. We did a legal guide for Tanzania for the seed sector alone, and we looked at about 80 different laws. For any regular person, including a lawyer, looking at 80 laws is a lot to have to look at. And if these things are all very detailed, which they always are, lawyers are very good at that, right? How do you break that down into something that's easier to understand and use? These are meant to be systems that work. So I'm very much in favor of having the right laws, but I also think that we have to find ways to communicate what's in those requirements, whether it's a WTO agreement or a law or regulation, so that they're easily accessible. So we've done a lot of these legal guides. We've done a legal guide for small entrepreneurs in East Africa. We've done a legal guide for women. We've done legal guides that are very sector specific. And we've done also a lot of what I call case studies, where we've worked directly with an entrepreneur who's facing a systemic challenge, something that's impacting every entrepreneur in the market. And we've walked through the problem with them to try to understand what are some of the top priorities, where are the laws that are impacting them, how is trade really impacting them on a day-to-day level, and then what are some of the other areas of law that maybe come into these. So we've done them on AGOA, we've done them on regional trade agreements in Africa, everything from financial services to traditional trade, to SPS, to how these trade preference programs work when you're actually trying to export something, which is an interesting process to go through. So that has also, I think, been really instructive for me after working in trade for so long, and for those I know who also do trade policy, to really think about that perspective. And one of my goals is to scale that up so that we have more and more of these case studies. 2 minutes, I can do that. Okay, so this is the value chain approach that I mentioned, and the legal guides and the case studies and these other approaches can all be built around this. But I think that it tends to be, a matter of sort of looking at the system as a whole and then breaking it down a bit into the pieces that are part of it and thinking about what happens at each of those levels. So in agriculture, this would be, starting at the production level and looking also at issues like land tenure, which are outside of the traditional trade law and policy, of course, but impact every economic decision everywhere. And how do you aggregate some of the economic functions through things like producer organizations or cooperatives? How are inputs regulated? I have spent a lot of time working on law and regulation around seeds, which is part of trade. It's covered by the TRIPS agreement, it's covered by the SPS agreement. It's this very technical area, though, where working in agriculture in a lot of countries is where things can sometimes really go awry. Fertilizer, of course, too. You need to have good seeds and fertilizer on the market. So how do you make that happen? And how do the laws really impact that? And what I'll do with a study like this is look at what is in the WTO agreements, which is usually somewhat general, and then go layers down to see what really is specifically happening in country. And talk to as many companies and as many stakeholders as possible, because their experiences are often very different than what it says on the books. And those are the things that will give a sense of what the system is really doing in practice. Storage and logistics, this directly relates to trade facilitation like we talked about before. Services, which I think is becoming an increasingly important area in trade, and it's one that's starting to get more and more notice. The LDC services waiver I mentioned is one really good example of that, but I think it's also a place where there's more that could be done. Processing, where the standards come in, and SPS and TBT, of course, are a big issue. Packaging, what requirements are there for processing something and putting it out onto the market? We talk so much in trade about value addition. Well, this is part of that, really understanding what those rules look like for adding value. And then markets, of course, which is at the end of the value chain. It's not the only part of the value chain. How do you get to a market both within a country? How do you get to regional markets? How do you get to international markets? And then there are many cross-cutting issues. I mentioned financial services and energy regulation, but there are many other things, and some of the things that I talked about within the value chain are actually quite cross-cutting. The map, and it's not the best one. I've never been able to find the perfect map for this, so if anybody has one, I will be glad to see it and use it instead. But this is a map of Africa, of course, and all of those bonds are corridors. And what's so interesting about this was that most of them are roads. Some of them are rail networks, but most of them our roads. The dotted lines are places where there's more construction being done. Again, I think this map doesn't capture everything. This was looking at the corridors that were officially recognized by the African Union. But what's interesting about this is that there was a structure for trade that was built, and most of it was built, honestly, to take minerals and raw materials out of Africa. And so these trade routes were kind of stemmed from that. Well, Nelson Mandela, it was the one who could be credited with this vision for this. He said, look, this is already the structure that we have. Why couldn't we build off of that and try to understand around that where the economic opportunity lies? And where are the groups of farmers who don't have access to a market? What are the things that we really want to see coming out of our trade? How can we trade better with each other? And so this kind of becomes the foundation then for something that can, really be a multidimensional way of looking at trade and markets. And so we've been fortunate to work on some projects around this in sub-Saharan Africa. We're working with a group in Tanzania, for example, called the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, which, as its name suggests, is an agriculture-specific corridor. That's been a pilot of the World Economic Forum that's now being replicated in other countries. We're looking at taking this approach in India with the World Bank. And I think this has a lot of potential application. This is my last slide. So I'm going to close with this and just leave these as a few ideas on the table, but I hope we have a chance to discuss a bit, and thank you for patiently bearing with my landscape of trade development. Thank you.